Chapter 1. The Iron Saint left to rot. The ship did not sleep. It waited. It loomed beyond the breakwater like a collapsed cathedral, its spine bowed, its towers eroded into crooked spires, its skin blistered and flaking under 60 years of salt and sun. Fog gathered around it not by chance, but by habit, as if the sea itself wished to veil what had been abandoned. Gulls circled, without crying. Even the waves softened as they neared the hull, as though the water remembered kneeling here once. They called it an aircraft carrier, but that word felt too small now. It was a saint of iron, venerated by engines and oaths, fed by sacrifice and fuel and the quiet faith of men who believed steel could carry them safely across an uncaring world. Its ribs, vast, curved beams, showed through ruptured plating like the bones of a colossal martyr left unburied. Rust crawled over it in slow, deliberate veins, orange and black, mapping decades of decay with devotional patience. Inside its hull, sailors had once prayed. Not formally, not aloud, but every man who crossed its gangways carried a prayer folded into his chest. Please let the deck hold. Please let the launch clear. Please let the sea take someone else today. The carrier heard them all. It absorbed them into its bulkheads, into the grease-blackened ladders and the low ceilings that forced men to bow their heads as if in reverence. No god answered those prayers. The ship learned instead. When the final crew left, they did so quietly. No band played. No flags snapped in farewell. Boots echoed one last time through the corridors, then faded into the wind. The engines were shut down like extinguished candles. Orders were given, logged, obeyed. The carrier was sealed and left to rot, an artifact, a relic, a responsibility deferred to another generation. But something did not leave with them. Deep within the ship, beyond the hangar bays and the gutted control rooms, there lingered a presence shaped by routine and obedience. It had learned the sound of footsteps, the cadence of commands, the way fear tightened voices before battle. It had no name, but it remembered every name ever spoken within these walls. It remained awake, listening to the slow drip of condensation, to the grinding patience of corrosion, to the ocean pressing its ear against the hull like a penitent seeking absolution. The first restoration crew arrived at dawn, their vessel cutting through the fog like a blade through old cloth. They spoke in measured tones, professional and practiced, their words clipped by radios and checklists. None of them joked as they approached. Even before stepping aboard, they felt the weight of the ship's shadow, heavy and cold, falling across the water. Jesus, one of them murmured, barely audible, as the carrier emerged fully from the mist. Another answered without looking up. Don't start that. The gangway groaned when it was set against the hull, metal complaining to metal like an old wound reopening. As the first boot touched the deck, the sound echoed too long, stretching down corridors that should have swallowed it. The air smelled wrong, stale, metallic, tinged with oil long dried, and something else beneath it, something damp and breathlike. They moved slowly, flashlights cutting pale tunnels through darkness that seemed to recoil but not retreat. Dust lay thick as ash, undisturbed except where water had traced thin, wandering paths across the deck. The painted lines for aircraft were still visible, ghosts of order and purpose beneath the grime. This place feels. One of the younger crew trailed off. Big, another offered. No, the first said. Like it knows we're here. They laughed then briefly because that was easier than silence. The sound bounced back to them warped, as if the ship were trying to repeat it and failing. Below deck, the corridors narrowed. Pipes ran overhead like petrified intestines, dripping slowly, rhythmically. Every drop landed with a hollow tap that sounded too much like a clock. Doors stood ajar, their hinges seized with rust, their labels half-eaten by time. Names were scratched into the paint, some careful, some frantic, layered over one another like prayers carved into stone. A flashlight beam caught on a chapel space near the bow, small and stripped bare. The benches were gone, the altar removed, but the outline of a cross still stained the wall, darker than the surrounding metal. Someone had written beneath it in charcoal or grease, the words smeared and almost illegible. "We left it here." "Probably a joke," someone said, though no one sounded convinced. Further in, the ship began to answer their presence. A clang echoed from somewhere below, heavy and resonant, like a bell struck underwater. Radios crackled without prompting, whispering fragments of static that almost resolved into voices. A hatch slammed shut behind them with deliberate force, though no one had touched it. "Did you feel that?" a woman asked, her hand still on the ladder rail. The rail felt warm. They documented everything because that was their job. Photos, notes, measurements. They spoke less as the hours passed, their words absorbed by the vastness of the hull. The ship's interior seemed to rearrange itself subtly, passageways longer than remembered, stairwells leading not quite where they should. More than once, someone swore they heard footsteps pacing them just beyond the beam of the flashlight. In the engine room, silence pressed down like a physical weight. The great turbines sat dormant, immense and patient, their surfaces slick with old oil. One of the crew reached out, almost unconsciously, and laid a hand against the casing. He jerked it back with a gasp. "What?" someone demanded. "It's humming," he said. "Not loud. Just like it's dreaming." They decided to leave then, to return with daylight and heavier equipment. As they retraced their steps, the fog outside thickened, pressing against the portholes until the world beyond the hull vanished entirely. The carrier creaked, a low, satisfied sound that traveled through the deck plates and into bone. At the gangway, they hesitated. The sea below was perfectly still. No waves touched the hull. No gulls cried. The fog swirled, but did not part. From deep within the ship came another sound, slow, measured, unmistakably rhythmic. Footsteps. Not many, just one set. Pacing. Waiting. The carrier had been alone for 60 years. It had not forgotten how to receive worshippers. Chapter 2. Decks that remember footsteps. The first sound was not the wind, but the echo of a march that had no feet. Rust had bloomed across the flight deck in disciplined patches, spreading like a disease that respected old formations. Where boots had once struck steel in perfect cadence, corrosion now traced their paths, outlining invisible ranks. The painted lines, once crisp, once sacred, had faded into pale scars, but they still guided the eye, pulling it forward, urging it to follow patterns learned long ago. The deck remembered order. The deck demanded it. By day, the restoration crew told themselves the noises were structural. Metal contracting, wind funneling through empty superstructure, birds landing, then fleeing. They said these things aloud, as if naming them might cage them. By night, those explanations thinned, stretched, and finally tore. Darkness fell early here. The carrier drank the light, swallowing the sun behind its island tower until the deck lay under a bruised sky. Floodlights snapped on with reluctant flickers, casting long, warped shadows that bent and overlapped like kneeling figures. The wind rose then, not chaotic, not wild, but steady, directional, moving in lines. It crossed the deck in ranks. A low, rhythmic moan slid between the railings, rising and falling with unnatural regularity. It sounded almost like breath forced through clenched teeth. Almost like counting. "Do you hear that?" someone whispered, though there was no reason to whisper anymore. "I hear it," another answered. "Don't say what it sounds like." They stood near the center line, helmets tilted, gloved hands resting on tools they had forgotten how to use. The wind passed them, brushing their clothes, tugging at loose straps, arranging them without asking. One man found his feet shifting unconsciously, heels aligning with a faded stripe. "Stop," he muttered to himself, stepping back. The deck creaked in protest. Somewhere above, a loose panel banged once. Twice. Then stopped, precisely on the third beat. The ship had always been a place of repetition. Drill after drill, command after command, men reduced to motion and response. Over decades, those repetitions had soaked into the steel. The carrier had learned them the way a body learns pain, deeply, permanently. Now, with living men returned, it practiced again. At midnight, The footsteps began. They were not loud. They did not hurry. They moved with the assurance of something that knew exactly where it was going. Across the deck they went, heel to toe, their rhythm too clean to be random. When the crew followed the sound with their lights, the beams slid over empty steel, catching only rust and shadow. "There's nothing there," a woman said, her voice tight. "Then why is it stopping when we stop?" someone else asked. They tested it, reluctantly. One man took a step forward. The footsteps resumed, matching him. He froze. They froze. He stepped back. They retreated in perfect counterpoint. "Jesus Christ," someone breathed. "It's drilling us." A laugh rose from the group, brittle and short-lived. No one joined it. They found old loudspeakers bolted along the island, their grills choked with grime. When the wind hit them just right, it forced air through corroded circuitry, producing a whisper that crawled across the deck. Words emerged, not whole, not clear, but shaped by memory. "Formed up. Hold a line." Again, the phrases repeated, breaking apart, reassembling themselves like bones in a shallow grave. One of the older crew members, a man who had served decades ago on a different carrier, closed his eyes. "It used to sound like this," he said quietly, "right before dawn, when you were too tired to think and too trained to stop." No one asked him how he knew. As the nights passed, the deck grew less forgiving. Tools left unattended shifted positions. Chalk marks drawn for measurements were smeared into arrows pointing nowhere useful. A man woke screaming after dreaming he had missed a command and been forced to run the deck forever, his legs moving long after they had turned to smoke. They began to hear voices layered into the wind. Not shouting. Never shouting. Commands did not need volume here. They came low, confident, threaded with authority that brooked no refusal. Step. Turn. Again. A young engineer pressed his hands over his ears. "Make it stop," he whispered. "Please. I'm doing it right. I am." The deck lights flickered, then steadied. One night, just before the hour when exhaustion turns to delirium, the footprints appeared. They were shallow depressions in the rust, forming slowly, one after another, as if something heavy but unseen were pacing the deck. They followed the old drill patterns exactly, circling, stopping, pivoting. The crew watched from the edge, afraid to interrupt. "Who's calling it?" a woman asked. "There has to be a caller." The loudspeaker crackled. "You already know." No one slept after that. The ship seemed pleased. By the sixth night, the wind brought with it the smell of sweat and oil, sharp and unmistakable. Helmets grew heavier. Spines straightened against will. When a radio squawked, several crew members snapped to attention before realizing what they were doing. "Knock it off," the foreman snapped, but his voice wavered. "This isn't funny anymore." The deck answered with a long, resonant clang, as if struck by an invisible baton. From the far end of the flight deck, something began to move. Not fast. Not slow. With ceremony. The footprints advanced toward them, stopping at the exact point where a formation would traditionally halt. The wind died abruptly, leaving a silence, so complete it rang. Then, from every loudspeaker at once, a whisper rose, layered, multiplied, ancient. Present, the crew stood frozen, breath fogging the air. One man felt his arm lift against his will, hand flattening at his side. Another felt his heel grind into rust, aligning perfectly with the line beneath it. Arms. The deck groaned, deep and satisfied, as if completing a long-forgotten exercise. In the silence that followed, the footprints turned, slowly, deliberately, toward the edge of the deck, toward the dark, waiting sea. Chapter 3. The silence beneath the hangar. Silence fell here like a blade laid flat against the throat. Beneath the flight deck, the hangar opened its vast mouth and swallowed light whole. Darkness pooled across the floor in thick, unmoving shadows, as if it had weight, as if it could stain. The ceiling vanished upward into blackness, ribbed with beams that disappeared before the eye could follow them. Once, aircraft had slept here, Great metal birds folded and waiting, but now the space held only echoes and the memory of fuel-soaked air. The carrier breathed differently below deck, slow and damp, each exhale a whisper of rot and old oil. The crew descended cautiously, their boots ringing too loud against the steel. Every step seemed to bruise the silence. Floodlights mounted on portable stands cut cones through the dark, revealing scattered debris. Crates split open and empty, chains coiled like shed skins, tool carts abandoned mid-task as if their owners had been called away and never returned. The floor was slick in places, not wet, not dry, something in between clinging. "Keep close," the foreman murmured, though there was no need to raise his voice. Sound traveled strangely here, flattening itself, dying early. No wandering. No one intended to wander. The hangar did not invite it. Names lined the bulkheads. They had been scratched into the steel with care, some shallow, some cut deep enough to curl the metal. Hundreds of them overlapped, layered like sediment. Dates accompanied many, clustered around years of deployment and war. Others bore only names, repeated again and again, as if the writer had feared forgetting their own. A woman raised her light to one such cluster and inhaled sharply. Those weren't there yesterday. The names gleamed wetly, darker than the surrounding rust. As they watched, a thin line crept down from one of the letters, slow and deliberate, like a drop of fresh ink, or blood, finding gravity. "No," someone said. "No, that's just condensation." But condensation did not spell anything. Tools began to vanish within the hour. A wrench set down beside a generator was gone when its owner turned back. A flashlight flickered, went dark, and was not where it had fallen moments later. Radios crackled, then fell silent, their batteries drained as if sucked dry. Each disappearance was small, explainable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that tightened the chest. "It's like it doesn't want us leaving marks," a young technician whispered. "Like it wants things how they were." "Nothing wants anything," the foreman snapped, but his eyes did not leave the darkness above them. "This is a ship, not a—" The lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then steadied. In the brief blackout, something moved. Not fast. Not slow. Just enough to rearrange the shadows. They worked on because stopping felt worse. Measurements were taken, notes recorded, plans drawn for removing corroded sections of the hangar wall. Every scrape of metal against metal echoed too long, as if repeated by unseen hands. Sweat cooled on skin, leaving a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "Do you hear that?" someone asked. They all did. A low sound threaded through the silence, barely audible, like breath held too long. It came from everywhere and nowhere, rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested patience. The carrier listened as they listened, attentive, possessive. At the far end of the hangar, behind a collapsed partition, they found a maintenance alcove that had escaped earlier surveys. The door hung crooked, its warning placards peeled away. Inside, the air was thick, unmoving. The walls were covered. Not with names this time, but with tallies, hundreds of them, scratched in neat rows. Some had been crossed out. Others circled. At the center of the wall, larger than the rest, was a phrase carved so deeply it had nearly pierced the steel. "Still counting." "Who would do this?" a woman whispered. The hangar answered with a soft, satisfied creak. When they turned back, the door was no longer where it should have been. The partition behind them stretched farther than remembered, the familiar landmarks subtly wrong. Lights hummed, then dimmed, casting the tallies into deeper shadow. "We didn't go far," the foreman said, more to himself than anyone else. "We didn't." A voice drifted through the dark, close to the ear, but not quite inside it. "Touch nothing." Another followed, overlapping, older, worn smooth by repetition. "Leave it be." Hands trembled. One man backed away, bumping into a tool cart that should not have been there. The cart rolled an inch, then stopped, as if braced. "I want out," someone said. "I don't care about the schedule. I want out now." The lights went out completely. In the darkness, the hangar filled with sound. Metal groaned. Chains rattled without moving. Footsteps crossed the floor, many of them, circling, converging. The smell of oil grew sharp, fresh, as if lines had been opened somewhere deep in the ship. Breathing grew loud, ragged, too human to be comforting. Then, softly, from every direction at once, came the sound of writing. Scratching. Etching. Names being added. When the lights flickered back on, the crew stood exactly where they had been, but the walls had changed. New names glistened among the old. Dates that had not yet passed nestled between those long gone. One name stood out, still bleeding slightly, its letters uneven. A living man's name. "That's not funny," he said hoarsely. "That's not. Who did that?" No one answered. The hangar's ceiling groaned, and a distant thud echoed from above, as if something massive had shifted its weight. Dust rained down in a fine mist, catching the light like falling ash. The breath sound returned, closer now, fuller. The carrier did not like to be touched. It liked to be remembered. From somewhere deep within the ship came the sound of a hatch sealing shut, heavy and final. The lights dimmed once more, settling into a sickly glow. On the far wall, beneath the newest name, another line began to carve itself into the steel, slow, patient, inevitable, its message unfinished as the darkness crept back in. Chapter 4. Restoration of a Sleeping Giant. The scream came from the metal, and it traveled through bone. It was not a sound that reached the ear so much as one that settled into the body, a pressure felt behind the eyes and at the base of the spine. When the first torch bit into the hull, the carrier answered, not with sparks or flame, but with a deep, resonant complaint that seemed to rise from everywhere at once. The steel vibrated, slow and immense, like a bell struck beneath the sea. The workers froze. "Keep cutting," the foreman said, after a moment that stretched too long. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled on the clipboard. "It's just stress in the plates." The torch flared again. The scream returned, lower this time, thicker, as if something had turned over in its sleep. They had prepared for resistance of a mechanical sort. Corrosion, warped beams, seized bolts that would refuse to turn. They had not prepared for the feeling that the ship was aware of the blade, that it was registering the intrusion with ancient patience. The hull had endured storms, explosions, decades of abandonment. This was different. This was touch. As the cut widened, the air changed. A cold flowed outward from the wound, carrying with it the smell of deep water and old fires. The torchlight bent strangely along the edges of the opening, shadows stretching and recoiling like startled animals. Somewhere within the ship, a distant alarm began to pulse. Once, twice, then fell silent, as if embarrassed to have spoken. "Did we trip something?" a welder asked, lifting his mask. "No systems are live," came the reply over the radio. "There's nothing left to trip." They did not say what everyone was thinking, that the carrier had remembered how to warn itself. Work continued in fits and starts. Every cut drew the same response, a deep, internal reverberation that left teeth aching and thoughts sluggish. The ship resisted not by force, but by presence. It loomed closer with every hour, filling peripheral vision, crowding the mind. Men found themselves apologizing under their breath before striking sparks. "I'm sorry," one muttered, not realizing he had spoken aloud. At night, the dreams began. They came with the certainty of orders and the intimacy of confession. The workers dreamed of oceans without horizon, water stretching endlessly beneath skies stripped of stars. They dreamed of standing on the deck as alarms rang from no visible source, the sound rolling in waves that never resolved into meaning. They dreamed of voices, many voices, whispering commands in tongues that felt older than steel, older than engines, older than the idea of war itself. "Hold," the voices said. "Hold." Men woke gasping, sheets damp with sweat, ears ringing with phantom klaxons. Some dreamed of marching until their feet bled rust. Others dreamed of counting, names, steps, heartbeats, numbers that refused to end. One man dreamed he was the ship, vast and immobile, feeling small figures crawling across the skin with knives of light. "I don't want to sleep anymore," a young technician whispered over stale coffee. His eyes were ringed dark, his hands shaking. "Every time I close them, I hear it breathing." "It's just stress," someone offered weakly. "No," the technician said. "Stress doesn't call you by name." They found evidence of the dreams etched into waking hours. Chalk marks appeared on bulkheads that no one remembered drawing. Tools were arranged in precise lines when left unattended. Once, a welder discovered a perfect circle of footprints around his workstation, toes pointed inward, as if something had been watching him work. The carrier responded to progress with memory. When a section of plating was removed near the bow, the smell of incense drifted out, faint but unmistakable. When a corroded ladder was replaced, the sound of boots echoed down a corridor that had not been walked in decades. The ship replayed itself, not as it had been, but as it had felt: fear, discipline, devotion, all braided into its steel. "Stop anthropomorphizing it," the foreman snapped when someone voiced the thought. "It's a structure." The structure groaned in reply, a long, satisfied sound that rolled through the deck plates. On the 5th day, the alarms returned. They did not blare. They whispered. A low hum seeped from speakers that had long ago lost their wiring, threading through the ship like a vein. It rose and fell in cadence with the work, growing louder when torches flared, quieter when they paused. The sound carried words just at the edge of comprehension. Again, "Not yet," deeper. One of the welders tore off his mask, breathing hard. "It's telling us what to do." "Shut it down," the foreman barked into the radio. "Kill all power. All of it." "There is no power," came the answer, thin with static. "There never was." That night, the dreams synchronized. Men woke at the same hour, hearts pounding, the taste of salt on their tongues. They described the same vision in fragments, pieced together in the dim light of the mess hall, a vast chamber beneath the ship, deeper than any schematic allowed, where the steel walls curved inward like ribs. In the center, something lay coiled and listening, wrapped in layers of command and repetition, its form indistinct but immense. "It's not dead," someone whispered. It was never dead. It was ordered to sleep. The next morning, the cut was complete. The section of hull peeled away with a reluctant shriek, revealing a passage that should not have been there. It sloped downward, smooth and uncorroded, the steel dark and warm to the touch. Faint lights glimmered along its length, pulsing gently, like the slow beat of a heart. "This isn't on any plan," the foreman said. His voice sounded small. The passage breathed. From its depths came the sound of movement, not footsteps, not quite, but a shifting, settling presence, adjusting itself after a long confinement. The alarms ceased abruptly, replaced by silence, so complete it pressed against the ears. A voice rose from the darkness, layered and calm, carrying the authority of 1,000 rehearsed commands. "Continue." The workers stood at the threshold, caught between training and terror. Sparks still drifted from cooling metal behind them. Ahead, the ship waited, newly opened, its wound yawning and patient. Somewhere deep within the carrier, something vast finished waking and began to remember what it had been built to command.